This episode of Analog Resurgence is brought to you by Squarespace. Use the link in the description of this video or the code Analog Resurgence to get 10% off your first purchase at Squarespace. Large format photography is an incredible way of capturing an image that involves precise and methodical work for setting up, composing, and finally exposing your picture. Large format is how we refer to any film type that is usually 4 inches by 5 inches or over. So this can be 4 by 5, of course, but can also be formats like 5 by 7 or 8 by 10 or 11 by 14 film. Or there are people who are working with cameras and films that are enormous. Some of those formats are more obscure than others, and today I just want to look at the very basics of 4x5 photography, something that I enjoy very much in terms of the process, but don't necessarily do very often. Large format film comes in what's called sheet film. 35mm and medium format come in convenient rolls that you can load easily on the go, but sheet film requires absolute darkness in order for you to handle it. 4x5 film comes in a box that looks like this. When you open it, there's another box inside of that, and when you open that, there's an envelope that contains your film. Luckily today, 4x5 film is very much alive, with the film being available in stocks such as HP5, FP4, Portra, Ektachrome, Ektar, Delta 100, Tri-X, T-Max, Arista EDU, Rowley Infrared, Fomapan, and even more. Depending on the film that you buy, the box may contain 10 or 20, 50, or even 100 sheets of film inside of them, but 10 or 20 is usually the most common. A sheet of 4x5 film looks like this, and this is obviously exposed and unusable film now that I just kind of have around for examples. This sheet is the size of your negative, or positive of course if you're shooting a reversal stock. One single exposure is this big, so if you buy a box of 10 sheets of film, that's going to be 10 shots. These film sheets always have notches on one corner, which helps you to identify the specific film type in a darkroom or a dark bag. All film types have a different notch, and the notch is also displayed on the back of the film box for identification. This notch also allows you to determine which is the emulsion side of the film and which is the back of the film, which is very, very, very important. When you're holding the film and the notch on the sheet is on the top right or on the bottom left, then the emulsion side is facing you. That's always an incredibly important tip to remember when you're handling this film in the dark. You also need to make sure that you're handling the sheet of film very carefully just around the edges when you're loading it. In order for you to use the film in the camera, sheet film needs to be loaded into a film holder, which usually looks like this. A standard film holder will hold 2 sheets of film, one on either side of it, and there are 2 dark slides which protect the film from the light while they're in the holder. Loading these holders is done in complete darkness using either a fully dark room or a light-proof changing bag, which is a really useful tool to have when working with this film format. The film holder has a side that folds open when the dark slide is removed, and the sheet of film needs to be inserted into the grooves below a small guide. This has to happen on both sides of the film, and the sheet must slide in all the way. Make sure not to slide it into these further up guides either. It goes right on the very bottom of the holder. It's also easier in the dark if you only remove the dark slide a portion of the way to allow for the film to be inserted. Just be absolutely sure that you're inserting the film with the emulsion side facing up so that it can capture the image when you're exposing it in the camera. Once you've loaded a film holder, then it's definitely worth labeling it with a bit of tape or something to let you know what's in it or if you've exposed it or not, or even throw an elastic band around it just for a little bit of added security to make sure that nothing moves out of place when you put it in a bag. A fully loaded film holder means that 2 sheets of film are ready to be shot, which means that all you need now is the camera. 4x5 cameras, sometimes called view cameras, come in 2 different types. There are of course oddities and things that don't fit perfectly into these categories, but really 2 main types of cameras: field cameras and monorail cameras. My 4x5 camera is a Crown Graphic Graphlex camera, which falls into the category of field cameras but is technically a press camera. Press cameras were used heavily in the first half of the 1900s by press photographers, mainly due to their size, weight, and overall convenience of being able to shoot on 4x5 film. They're relatively easy to learn with and can be cheaper than a lot of other 4x5 cameras out there, but have limitations and don't allow for you to take full advantage of shooting on this format in the way that other cameras might. Field cameras, including press cameras, are cameras that are easy to travel with. They usually fold up into a more convenient size. Sometimes they're entirely contained within housing, or at the very least on some sort of bed or base. They have a lens at the front, a ground glass focusing screen on the back, and bellows in the middle. Because of how field cameras are contained in a housing or on this sort of base, the movements that can be made for rise, fall, swing swing, tilt, and shift are very limited. Monorail cameras allow for greater movement because of how they're designed. They're not in a housing or really contained at all, but instead exist on a single rail which needs to be attached to a tripod or a base in order to use. They're less compact and convenient, but allow for less restrictions in terms of movement. Movement on a 4x5 camera allows you to change the angle or position of the lens in relation to the film plane so that you can alter what the film is capturing. Changing the angle of the lens to the film plane, for example, would change what's in focus. We see this in things such as tilt shift photography, where a small portion of the shot is in focus and a surrounding area is out of focus. On different formats, you can do this with tilt shift lenses, but on a full-on 4x5 camera, you can do this by actually tilting and shifting the lens. Movements like rise and fall just allow you to manipulate your composition without having to fully move the camera itself. Higher-end field cameras can have some of these movements, but press cameras really only allow for a bit of movement because they're not exactly designed with that flexibility in mind. Field cameras, in comparison to monorail cameras though, may also have flash mounts, viewfinders, and even rangefinders on them. There's a lot of different brands out there from decades and decades of 4x5 photography. Ones you're going to come across are the Graphlex models, Crown Graphics, Speed Graphic. A number of these ones were made. There's also Toyo field cameras, Intrepid 4x5 cameras, Chamonix 4x5 cameras, Horseman, Linhof, Cambo, Sinar. A lot of great camera bodies out there for 4x5 photography. But also, because large format cameras are essentially just an area for the lens, an area for the film back, and bellows or something that connects the two in between, you can pretty much make your own large format camera. And people have also made them from things like watermelons, pineapple, a loaf of bread. A lot of fun experimentation within this format that really goes beyond the hardcore professional definition of it. There's also pinhole cameras and 3D printed stuff. A lot of creativity exists for shooting sheet film. Things like the handheld cameras that Cameradactyl makes. There are other sheet film formats out there that are smaller than 4x5 and more obscure, such as 3¼ by 4¼ film. Just be sure that you're buying 4x5 equipment and not gear for an odd format. As much as I love my Graphlex, it's not the ultimate 4x5 camera, but as somebody who only shoots a little bit of 4x5, it's definitely enough for me. I'm gonna look at the main components of the Graphlex and then go through the process of setting up and capturing an image on 4x5. When closed, the Graphlex looks like a pretty nondescript box. I have a leather strap on the side of mine that I really like for easy carrying, and there's some metal mounts on the other side that are actually for old and obsolete flash units which I don't use. There's a tripod socket on the bottom and on the side of the camera depending on the orientation that I want to shoot in. Some cameras have a fully rotating back on them so you don't have to rotate the camera, but the Graphlex and I think all press cameras usually don't. To open it up, I press on this little bump on the top and the rails fold out. The lens and bellows are collapsed into the housing. On view cameras, that front area of the camera is called the front standard. In front of the lens are my focusing rails, where the lens will move back and forth for my focusing. Below the lens, I have a latch that gets released, and the front standard is pulled out to the proper infinity stops for the lens I currently have mounted on the camera. The infinity stops are where my lens is focused to infinity when it's pulled out to that point and when the rails are all the way in. From here, I focus by using these knobs to move the rail, which moves the lens. Lenses on a 4x5 camera are mounted onto a lens board, and the lens itself usually contains the actual shutter and the camera body doesn't. There are exceptions to this, such as the Speed Graphic, which is a full shutter mechanism in the body, but typically view cameras are just bellows connecting a lens to the film. Different lenses can require a different size lens board, and you'll definitely need to do a bit of your own research in terms of the lens that you have to make sure you have the right size that fits on your camera and will mount the lens. But the internet can be full of incredibly helpful information, I assure you. There's different sizes for lens board openings based on the lens that you have, and you'll see things like Copal 0, 1, 3 kind of thrown around as an indicator for the different boards. The board can be removed easily with these two sliding locks, and the lens is mounted using a retaining ring that screws on. The best tool for removing this is a spanner wrench, actually, which in general is a really useful thing to have when working with old cameras. So I got one of these for Christmas last year, and I definitely recommend it because it's nice to kind of have laying around. I have a 135mm Optar lens on my camera. The focal length of large format lenses is different from what you might be used to with 35mm cameras and medium format. For example, a 150mm lens on a 4x5 camera is equal to a standard 50mm lens on a 35mm camera. 90mm on a 4x5 is 28mm. 210mm on a 4x5 is a 70mm focal length on 35mm cameras. This 135mm lens is about what a 45mm focal length would look like on a 35mm camera. These lenses also usually don't have as wide an aperture as if you were shooting on a 35mm camera. Because the size of the negative is so big, we need a smaller aperture to achieve a good depth of field. f4 or 5.6 on a 35mm camera would allow for a nice depth of field, but that aperture when shooting 4x5 results in a pretty shallow depth of field. Because my lens contains the shutter, I can set my shutter speed and aperture right on the lens, and I can cock the shutter using this switch here. I can fire the shutter using this side switch, but very often when shooting large format, you should be using a cable release so that we're not touching the lens unit when exposing. Those smaller apertures of f16, f22, f32, even beyond that for some lenses, usually result in you having to do longer exposure times, which really isn't uncommon when working with large format. Cocking the shutter and pressing the switch on the other side of the lens allows me to open it for viewing so that I can compose and set focus, which brings me to the back of the camera. This area is called the rear standard of the camera and is where the film will go when we're ready to shoot. Large format cameras use ground glass to view the scene. By opening up our shutter, the image in front of the lens is projected onto the glass and shows us what will be exposed onto the film. The image is going to be inverted when viewed on the ground glass because the lens is flipping it. You'll always be working upside down when viewing on the ground glass. My Graphlex has a ground glass hood which pops open and allows you to see the image on the glass a bit easier in bright light. You can also get covers that block out all the light that you put on the camera that makes composing much easier. Honestly, if I need to do this, I usually just have a black piece of material handy as opposed to like buying a full fitted cover for the camera. The Graphlex has a spring back for the ground glass, which is pretty common on 4x5 cameras and allows you to slide in a film holder without removing the entire glass. The holder just slides in between the body and the ground glass, and from there you can take a picture. Pressing down on the latches though, the ground glass can be removed entirely for using larger film holders, and this just leaves us with an open hole that has sliding locks on the top and the bottom. This is a Graphlock back, and for a very long time now has been the standard back for view cameras. This means that large format cameras with this type of back will be able to take all the same types of film holders that are out there. There are some exceptions to this, of course. Old and odd, strange film holders from the past might be a problem sometimes, but for the most part, a Graphlock back is what you're going to find on your camera, and a Graphlock back works for most film holders out there. So whatever holder you're using can be placed on the back of the camera and then just locked into place using the sliding guides. So that's my Graphlex, and in general, the basic components of a view camera. My Graphlex does have a rangefinder on the top, which works, but I prefer the ground glass usually. The rangefinder needs to be recalibrated for different lenses as well, using like a little insert that's up and inside the housing, so it's not a constantly reliable thing. I've loaded up 2 sheets of Kodak's Tri-X black and white film into a holder, so let's go shoot them. Setting things up to take a 4x5 image is a bit of work. It takes some time to get that camera positioned and ready to go before you can just snap that image. So not exactly the quick shooting that people coming from smaller formats might be used to. Exposure is a key part of this process, and I'm by no means an exposure superstar here, but knowing even the basics will get you a very long way in this or any format when it comes to shooting film. A very useful tool for large format shooters is the spot meter. A spot meter is a handheld light meter which allows you to look through and meter a specific area of your scene for an exposure value. Then you can decide the appropriate exposure settings for your camera in order to take the image that you want. The spot meter is a pretty narrow field of view, so you can just take an exposure value from different regions of your image, and then using the meter, the exposure value number that you're given can be paired up with appropriate shutter and aperture values for an exposure. There's a lot to the intricacies of exposure and things like the zone system, which will allow you to expose very precisely for a detailed scene, but for this video, I'm really just trying to cover the technical basics of 4x5. Using the spot meter, I'll meter a few different areas of the scene, so then I can average things out in order to capture a pretty general amount of detail in my dark and bright areas. Focusing is done with the shutter and aperture open, and making sure that the scene is sharp on the ground glass because that's where your film is going to sit. Another very useful tip is to use a film loop, which is a small magnifier that you can put on your ground glass to double check that everything is in perfect focus. I'm not doing that at the moment, mainly because I don't have a great loop right now, but I'm also using an aperture setting which will allow for a good depth of field on this nice bright day. With everything composed and focused properly, I close my lens up and I can slide in my film holder. It's super important to make sure your lens is closed before pulling out that dark slide or your film will be ruined. Cock the shutter, slide out the dark slide, fire the shutter using the cable release, and then reinsert the dark slide, and a 4x5 exposure has been captured. It's a slow and methodical process most of the time when working with film like this. Double and triple checking certain things before that film holder is finally inserted to take the actual pictures. But it is a very rewarding way to work. Large format photography has long been used for subjects such as portraiture and architecture, topics that benefit from that large image size capable of capturing a ton of detail. In a darkroom printing process as well, you can take a negative this size and make very, very detailed prints. A large negative means less magnification to get prints of a certain size, and you can even just contact print these to make a pretty good size print.
Hey, it's me. Let's talk about Squarespace. You want to build a website on the internet? Because the internet is really the only place where you would probably want to do that. Squarespace has got you covered. They've got all the different templates that make it super easy to do so that you can just kind of jump into it. You don't need to know coding and all the crazy stuff that usually goes along with web design. You don't really have to think about anything because Squarespace has got you covered for all of it. You can use it to make a website about literally anything, or maybe not anything, but I mean something within reason. Let's not go too crazy here. Combine that with their amazing support, and Squarespace really is the best way to write a blog or showcase your portfolio of work or sell stuff. If you're making stuff and you want to have a platform to be able to get it out to people, then Squarespace is the way to do it. Trust me, I'm just a man on a fire escape with a lot of traffic noise in the background that's destroying the audio of this ad. Squarespace.
Use the link in the description of this video or use the code AnalogResurgence at checkout in order to get 10% off your first purchase at Squarespace. In terms of developing 4x5 sheet film, I treat it very similar to everything else that I shoot. For the color developing, I take it to Downtown Camera here in Toronto, but for black and white sheet film, I develop it myself at home using a Mod 54 Patterson tank sheet film holder. In all honesty, I don't love this thing. The film is loaded around the stem and then held into place with these little guides, but loading it is tricky, and I've had it leave marks on the film and even had sheets move out of these guides during developing. It also requires almost an entire liter of chemistry to use, so it's not the most economical. I've heard a lot of good things about the Stearman 4x5 developing tank that looks like a flask, and that's probably what I want to upgrade to at some point if I continue to do this stuff. This isn't a developing video because I've already done the basics of film developing on the channel, and that still applies to working with sheet film, so just trust me when I say I developed these. I used some Ilford ID11 developer on this Tri-X film to get my final developed negatives. I'll also touch on scanning briefly. For home scanning this stuff, you can do camera scanning if you have a setup for this size of film, or you can flatbed scan them. Either of those methods necessarily take full advantage of all the detail and information of a 4x5 or large format negative, but for scanning at home, they're really the two most feasible options. I have an Epson V700, which is able to take 4x5 negatives for scanning, and the holders for this scanner are actually pretty decent as well for holding the sheet film. Really, the information that you can achieve in a scan of this size negative is just limited by the technical capabilities of the scanner that you use. I believe the best results for scanning large format film is by using what's called a drum scanner. You do have to find someone who's offering drum scans though, because most people are never going to personally own a drum scanner. Even just from scans on the Epson, there's a lot of detail in these shots that can be seen as we zoom in. The signs on the door of the subway entrance or the newspaper stand beside it, the greenhouse door in this image, they're very sharp, and combined with the latitude of modern film stocks, this type of format isn't something that digital can really compare with. Yes, we're limited by scanning technology, but in a darkroom, printing and enlarging 4x5 or 8x10 and beyond, that's when the possibilities of film become enormous. For these two shots, I'll briefly talk about my exposure. For the subway entrance, I used my spot meter to determine the exposure value for a few different regions in the scene. There's some contrast going on, but nothing so extreme that I was going to lose a lot of information, and Tri-X is really flexible. With exposure values ranging from 10 to 15 across the different areas of the scene, I decided to go with a value of 13, and using that number on my meter, I got the exposure information that I wanted. So this scene was shot at f16 with a shutter speed between 1/50th and 1/100th of a second. My second shot ended up being very similar because the lighting was very consistent that day. Just to be sure, I metered for the ground, the greenhouse itself, and then the sky behind it. This gave me an exposure value of 12, 13, and 14. So I went with 13 again and used the same exposure of f16 with a shutter speed of just under 1/100th of a second. This is some Portra 160 4x5 from a few years ago as well, which I love. The color and detail of this film stock in 4x5 is amazing, and some of my favorite stuff is color reversal film in 4x5. This is some Velvia film, and to actually look at something this big on a light pad is unreal. It's very hard to ever do this sort of thing justice in a YouTube video. The size of a 4x5 frame is just so much larger than a 35mm frame, or even what most people are shooting on medium format, like 6x6 or 6x4.5, and because of that size, it's able to capture so much more detail. 4x5 cameras also go beyond just shooting 4x5 film. Because of the wide variety of film holders that exist, you can use these cameras to shoot medium format film with a holder like this, which can do 6x7 sized exposures. Lomography is a 4x5 camera back that lets you shoot instax wide on these cameras, and I'm gonna do a video on this in just a few weeks actually. You can even shoot a variety of peel apart instant film types using backs like these Fuji and Polaroid ones. Good luck with that though, because quality pack film, 4x5 pack film, and 4x5 single shot peel apart film is all discontinued and pretty hard and expensive to find at this point. I've already done some videos on that instant stuff using these holders though, if you want to check that out. There's even digital backs that you can put on a 4x5 camera and capture a digital image, but the quality of a sensor that size and the current cost of something like that makes it just a little ridiculous. My favorite film holder is probably the Graphmatic, which can hold 6 sheets of film at once and allows you to shuffle through them as you shoot. It's very cool and so convenient when you want to have several sheets of film on hand without having to carry multiple holders. I love my Graphlex, and it definitely has its fair share of limitations, but I really enjoy the convenience of it. On a monorail camera, you can also usually change your bellows as well, which will allow you to mount a wider variety of interesting and wide angle lenses, but that again is another thing that is pretty limited and you can't usually do, especially on press cameras and a lot of field cameras. Old lenses like these usually have flash contacts on them too. It's not easy to get cables that use this anymore, but I stripped a female to female PC sync cable and made my own with some clips. This means I can hook up a modern flash to this old shutter, and because it's a leaf shutter, it will synchronize at a variety of shutter speeds. So who do I recommend 4x5 in large format for? Not many people, honestly. It's far more than most casual hobbyists need, and it's also very, very expensive once you get into it for even just the film. And I really only picked some of this stuff up and started exploring it myself because a few years ago I was working in a photo lab and had access to a lot of things that made it easier at the time. I was also at a camera show and picked up the Graphlex and a bunch of film holders for incredibly cheap, and that definitely makes things easier. It's a very exciting experience, I think, but not one that's worth jumping into without a big understanding of what's involved, and at the very least, the basic skill set required to do it effectively. If you are going to do it, then I recommend at least having the following things for a little kit. A camera, obviously, a lens with a built-in shutter, at least one film holder, though you'll probably want like 5 or 10. Film, of course, black and white is going to be the cheapest to start with. A changing bag, which is so convenient. A spot meter, a cable release, some archival sleeves for storing these negatives. The print file ones are always good. You might get things back from a lab in sleeves, but the print file stuff is always great for just putting into a binder. And then if you're deving and scanning yourself at home, then definitely a film holder or a tank of some sort that can handle sheet film, some cotton gloves, and a scanner capable of 4x5 such as the Epson V700 or V800, and just some black cloth to use on those sunny days when viewing the ground glass is a little difficult. Also, as I mentioned, a loop is always good for looking at the ground glass to ensure better focusing, and even a little bubble level can come in really handy for setting up the tripod and making sure the camera is situated properly. So there's quite a few things that you're gonna want. Work your way up to it is all I'm saying, because 4x5 and large format stuff in general can easily become a money pit, and ultimately you might find yourself not even shooting that format as much as you would thought. But wow, is it super nice. Thank you so much for checking this out. This is really just meant to be a basic rundown of shooting with 4x5 and the terminology and the information that goes along with this format. If you're looking for a lot of really quality large format videos, then definitely check out Matt Marish's channel. He works with this stuff way more frequently than I do. He's also involved with the Film Photography Project, which are awesome people as well. So definitely go check out Matt's channel. I'll link that in the description below. And while you're checking out the description below, there's also links for ways to support this channel through things like merch that I have available, and there's also a Patreon that helps me to just kind of keep chugging along with this stuff. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you soon.